You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcast on EU sanctions.
Sanctions have become a key element of the EU's common foreign and security policy.
They're an essential tool for the promotion of peace, democracy and respect for the rule of law, human rights and international law. But how do they work and are they effective? Stay with us.
The EU has traditionally been perceived as a soft power with limited ability to act politically and militarily. Whether that's true or not is a totally different discussion. What is true is that it was not until the 1980s that the EU began to adopt its own sanctions independently of the UN.
Since then, they have become an increasingly central element of the EU's foreign and security policy, and their number has increased from just 6 in 1991 to 311 at present. But what do we mean when we talk about sanctions?
Well, sanctions cannot be understood in a political vacuum. They are part of a comprehensive policy approach involving political dialogue, diplomacy, trade and cultural relations, and the use of other instruments.
They seek to persuade others to do things they otherwise wouldn't, or perhaps lead them to pay a higher price to do something than they otherwise might, with the overall objective being to safeguard our values and our security, to preserve peace and consolidate democracy and human rights, and to prevent conflicts and strengthen international security.
To this end, sanctions can target governments, companies, groups and organisations, as well as individuals that go against these values and principles. So sanctions can target terrorism, nuclear proliferation activities, human rights violations, the annexation of foreign territory, or the destabilisation of a sovereign country, as happened in Ukraine.
In 2004, the EU's Political and Security Committee agreed on some basic principles on the use of sanctions, their implementation, and how to measure and control their impact. So how do they work?
Well, early European sanctions often included very wide-ranging measures. For example, an embargo on Argentine imports in 1982 following the country's occupation of the Falkland Islands. But concerns about the humanitarian impact of the UN trade embargo on Iraq in the 1990s forced a shift by both the EU and the UN to a more targeted approach.
As a result, EU sanctions today aim for the maximum impact on the persons responsible for the behaviour requiring sanctions, typically the political and military leaders of a regime, without punishing the entire population.
That's often easier said than done, but it is the reason why the most commonly used EU sanctions are visa bans, asset freezes and arms embargoes, prohibiting weapons exports to countries such as China, Sudan and Yemen.
Economic sanctions are rarer, and where they exist, they tend to target one or two strategic activities rather than the economy as a whole. For example, current sanctions against Russia restrict EU exports of technology and services used by the country's oil industry to develop Arctic, deep water and shale oil reserves, but do not affect Russian exports of oil and gas to the EU.
There are, however, two exceptions to the principle of targeted sanctions, North Korea and Syria. And while they are less comprehensive than those against Iraq in the 1990s, still allowing humanitarian aid and limited trade, UN officials are concerned about the humanitarian impact of international sanctions against these two countries as they hinder the delivery of vital medical supplies.
So how do EU sanctions differ from UN or US sanctions?
The EU can impose restrictive measures either on its own initiative or to implement UN Security Council resolutions. So when opposition from permanent Security Council members such as Russia and China makes it impossible to adopt sanctions over violations of human rights, the EU can still decide to act on its own, as it has done against Belarus, Burundi, China and Venezuela.
And when UN-level sanctions are not possible, the EU aims for maximum impact by rallying as much international support as possible. But although the EU and the US often align their sanctions, there are substantial differences between the two, notably as regards their length and scope, with EU sanctions being generally for shorter periods and more targeted and territorially limited.
Apart from sanctions, the EU's toolkit also includes sanctions-like measures, such as cutting off bilateral negotiations, restricting development aid and loans, or temporarily suspending preferential access to EU markets for countries which have seriously and systematically violated EU principles, as has happened with countries such as Myanmar, Belarus and Sri Lanka.
Now, is the stick better than the carrot? And if yes, how effective is it? Stay with us.
Because sanctions do not operate in isolation, measuring their impact is not always easy, especially when we talk about visa bans, asset freezes and arms embargoes. But economic sanctions have a more measurable effect and have proved effective in many cases.
In 2015, the IMF estimated that EU and US sanctions were costing Russia 1.5% of its GDP per year, potentially rising to 9% in the long term.
Of course, the purpose of EU sanctions is not to cause economic pain, but to stop bad guys from behaving badly, to put things in very black and white terms. But judged by this criterion, one has to admit that sanctions more often fail than not.
EU and US sanctions have not been any more successful in curbing the brutality of the Assad regime in Syria than UN measures were in Libya under Gaddafi.
13 years of sanctions have also not managed to stop the fighting or restore democracy in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in fact, fewer than 1/4 of UN or EU sanctions do achieve their aims.
But there are also success stories, and perhaps one of the most obvious is the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which has blocked Iran's path to both uranium-based and plutonium-based nuclear weapons, even if the US administration has now called it into question.
By contrast, it would be difficult to argue that 12 years of EU and international sanctions have persuaded North Korea to abandon its nuclear aspirations. But the thing is, success is not always black and white, as has been proved by sanctions against Zimbabwe and Myanmar.
But that doesn't necessarily mean they're not effective, since even if targeted governments or persons cannot be persuaded to change their behaviour, they can be dissuaded from causing more harm, and they reaffirm the international values and principles that form the basis of our democratic societies.
What's clear is that the broader the international support for the sanctions, the more targeted they are, and the more democratic a country is, the greater the influence of sanctions.
And as criticism from the European Parliament has underlined, if there's one thing undermining the effectiveness of EU sanctions, it is their perceived lack of consistency.
Why put in place anti-proliferation sanctions against Iran and North Korea, but not against India and Pakistan? Or against Iran for human rights abuses, but not Saudi Arabia?
This apparent reluctance to adopt measures against countries that are allies or important trading partners or are powerful enough to retaliate leads public opinion to think that sanctions decisions are only motivated by strong political and economic interests, which seriously undermines their credibility.
But whatever the reason, deciding on sanctions among 28 players and enforcing them once in place is also no easy task. This is why, as the number of sanctions programmes continues to grow, some experts have called for more EU resources and closer coordination with member states to ensure that once in place, sanctions do work.
You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcast.